Elena, could we take a break after the work week? Go to a cafe? Do some shopping? The cheerful and lively woman asked her colleague, who was leaving the entrance of the furniture factory. I would love to, but I can't, Elena replied. Ah, always burdened with your own problems. What a cross you have to bear, my dear. I'm not complaining. Who else but me? Well, Daniela, here comes my tram. Elena Gassett, the accountant of the furniture factory, ran to the tram stop. Getting on the tram, she couldn't find a free seat and was left standing on the back platform of the creaking carriage. The words of her attentive colleague kept echoing in Elena's mind, burdened with her own problems. He was referring to her mother-in-law, 75 years old. Elena was widowed a year ago, and the burden of caring for her husband's mother fell on her mother-in-law. Mrs. Viktorovna had a tough character. She had worked in managerial positions all her life and was used to controlling everything and everyone. But a few years ago, her health began to deteriorate. She had difficulty walking, and she suffered a minor stroke. The death of her son weakened Mrs. Delgado even more. She could move around the apartment, but going to the store without help was almost impossible. In addition, at home, there were times when she could not stand up and fell on the way to the kitchen. Therefore, Elena always tried not to stay late at work and returned home in a hurry. She could not say that she did so with enthusiasm. Mrs. Delgado's harsh character, controlling tendencies, and sharp language caused Elena many inconveniences. The old lady always knew best where to put things, where Elena needed to go, and what time she needed to be home. Elena felt like she was trapped in a tower with a dragon, not knowing when she might break free. There were days when Elena simply did not want to go back to her mother-in-law. She struggled to contain her irritation and anger, to keep from lashing out at the frail woman. But Elena understood that Mrs. Delgado had no one left but her, and taking care of her was the best way to honor the memory of her late husband. That day, Elena was not particularly cheerful either. She knew she would have to give the routine report of the day and listen to Mrs. Delgado's orders. When she got home, Elena opened the front door, walked into the hallway, and heard her mother-in-law talking on the phone. "Yeah, you won't believe how everything worked out," Mrs. Delgado exclaimed excitedly. She could only speak in that tone with her lifelong friend, Mrs. Fuentes. Elena decided not to enter the room and waited for the conversation to end. "Elisa, now I will be able to successfully sell the apartment, live my last days with dignity, and free my daughter-in-law from her responsibilities. Yes, I signed the contract today. I have all the documents in my hands." At that moment, Elena sat up anxiously and listened even more attentively. What? What do you mean by shady real estate agents? You don't understand anything. I tell you that everything is legal. You don't need to come visit me. Stay at home. Mrs. Delgado raised her voice higher and higher. She sometimes argued with her friend. But Elena had never heard her mother-in-law speak in that tone. Mrs. Fuentes could also be blunt. She worked in the legal office of the same company that Mrs. Delgado ran. Mrs. Fuentes was currently on a well-deserved rest, but she still kept up with the latest legal developments, always warning her friend of new shady schemes. Elena heard her mother-in-law hang up the phone and entered the room. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Delgado," Elena greeted softly. "Hello, come here," the mother-in-law said as she sat down in her favorite chair. And she handed Elena some papers. "Read this." "What is this?" Elena asked, confused. "This is our happiness." Elena took the papers in her hands. One of them had the words, "Donation contract" written on it. Elena trembled and continued reading. "I, Matilda Delgado Longoria, of sound mind and clear memory, donate the apartment that belongs to me by right of ownership to the organization." Elena could not continue reading. With wide eyes, she looked at her mother-in-law and asked, "What are you doing?" Are you also surprised? Sit down, I will explain everything to you. Today, a young man and a woman came to see me. They represented a social organization that helps the elderly and provides care for them. In short, they offered me a deal. They will buy the apartment from me and make sure that I live in a nursing home, where I will receive care 24 hours a day. You understand, Eleanor, that I'm not getting any younger, and soon you won't be able to take care of me completely. This way, you can quietly go and live your own life. I don't understand anything. What's so hard to understand? I sold it a little cheaper than its market value. In exchange, I'll be provided with a place in the nursing home, a private room, a personal nurse, and a view of the forest. Isn't it like a fairy tale? But why does it say donation contract here? Because it's faster this way. The purchase transaction, or whatever it's called, takes a long time to process and involves a lot of paperwork. But here it's just a signature and that's it. But don't worry, I've taken care of everything. Look, I have a receipt from them, promising to pay me $250,000. Mrs. Delgado handed another piece of paper to her daughter-in-law. Eleanor looked at it. It was a handwritten receipt, you know. Eleanor began hesitantly. I'm not a lawyer, but I don't think receipts like this are issued in these cases. You think you know everything. The mother-in-law raised her voice again, this time towards Elena. You wanted to keep this apartment for yourself? Well, don't worry. That $250,000 will still be yours anyway. Why would I need your money? What are you saying? Eleanor started to justify herself. I'm worried that I might be tricked. It's all legal. What organization were those people from? Young Old Age, I think. Elena took out her phone and quickly searched for the name of that organization. The first link she clicked on started with the word scammers. She scrolled through dozens of reviews, each one containing stories about schemes to deceive elderly people. Mrs. Delgado, they are scammers. Is that what your internet says? The mother-in-law didn't want to listen to her daughter-in-law. They just write all kinds of rubbish there. Look, they indicated their address here. If you want, go check it yourself. Elena took the paper with the address, quickly got dressed, and left the apartment. The office of that organization was located in the city center, and Elena had to take the tram again. She was very anxious, not because of the apartment. Elena had a place to live. She still had the apartment where she and her husband lived together. Their children had grown up and moved to Moscow. So the apartment was empty, and if something happened, Elena could always return to it. She was worried about something else. Mrs. Delgado might not fare well in such a situation. Losing the apartment would be a real blow to her. And that wasn't even the worst-case scenario. Who knew what these people would want to do with Mrs. Delgado to avoid taking care of her in the nursing home? Eleanor didn't want to think about that. Yes, the mother-in-law was not the easiest person, and the daughter-in-law had suffered a lot because of it. But they were still family. Despite everything, Elena treated her well, simply understanding that each person has a different character. Moreover, when Elena and her husband started their relationship, Mrs. Delgado helped them a lot. That empty apartment was acquired with her participation, so Elena firmly decided to get to the bottom of the situation. After arriving at the designated address, the woman saw a small business center. Entering it, she asked the security staff for the office number and went up to the third floor. It was a run-down building of some factory hastily converted into office space. Arriving at the right door, Elena knocked and entered. "Working hours are over," said the woman sitting at the office desk in an unpleasant voice. She was already putting several papers into her bag and was clearly preparing to leave. The sign on the door says that she works until 7 p.m. "It is now 6:55, Elena replied sternly. "Okay, what do you want?" "Your company deceived an elderly woman today, my mother-in-law." "Miss, we do not deceive anyone. Everything is legal. No, do not try to deceive me. Your employees presented themselves as a social organization. That is exactly what we are. A social organization interrupted the woman to Elena for the second time. A social organization that deceives elderly people? I read reviews about you. I demand that you immediately terminate all contracts. Calm down, young lady, calm down. We conclude all contracts in accordance with the requirements of the law. So no one here is going to finish anything for you. Then I will file a complaint with the police against you. Go ahead and write it down. You are not the first, so to speak. First, people do not take care of their elderly relatives, and then they come here to complain. They don't even try to hide it. What are we not hiding? That people like you want to quickly get rid of their elderly relatives. How dare you? Elena couldn't believe what she was hearing. The woman was openly explaining her scheme without any shame. What? How dare I? We are doing you a favor. What do you think? That we don't have nursing homes and we just decided to take the apartment away from your naive relative? No, we actually send the elderly to places where they will be cared for, even better than you. Only they have to pay for it with a whole apartment. What did you expect? It's a business. These are the times we live in. See you in court, Elena said harshly and left the office. She couldn't believe what was happening to her. The scammers were sitting in the city center, and they didn't even hide their dark intentions. What good would it do her if they really sent Mrs. Delgado to a nursing home? She wouldn't live there for long anyway, knowing that she had been tricked. No, she had to find a way to expose these people no matter what. And Elena headed to the police station. She had never filed reports or been involved in legal proceedings before. But now she was prepared for anything. Such was her anger towards these individuals. The police station was located not far from the center of the office. Elena arrived on foot in just 10 minutes. Entering, she saw a sign that said, "On call." Elena walked up to the counter under the sign. "Hello, I would like to file a complaint," she said. "Take the form and write." The on-call officer mechanically replied, handing her the form. He sat on the phone and didn't even look at who was in front of him. Elena spent a long time writing the report, carefully choosing her words. She wanted the police to investigate everything as quickly as possible. After filling out all the fields on the form, Elena handed the report to the officer on duty. She finally looked away from the screen and started reading the report. "Okay, full name, address, phone number." "Okay." The officer's eyes quickly scanned the lines on the form. "Oh, young old age? Yes. Do you already know something about this organization?" We know. We already have 3 reports on them saved for a month." "And how are they being investigated?" "Well, they are not really moving forward. We have already checked this company. Everything seems clean. So you are trying to do something in vain. It is a dead-end case." "What do you mean, dead end? Are you refusing to accept my report?" "Oh no, young lady. We are not allowed to refuse it. We will file it away, and you will have to wait." Elena left the police station feeling dejected. She did not know what to do next. She did not want to go home again, but for different reasons this time. Elena didn't know how to explain to her mother-in-law that, in fact, they had been tricked, and that there was no chance of restoring justice. She simply couldn't say those words. Arriving home, Elena slowly climbed up to the correct floor and entered the apartment. Normally, Mrs. Delgado would have the television on full blast, but this time there was silence in the room. "Well?" Mrs. Delgado asked quietly. "We'll sort it out," Elena whispered. So, was it a scam after all? Mrs. Delgado was usually stubborn, but she could be persuaded in the end. This was one of those cases. It seemed so. Stupid old fool. Mrs. Delgado covered her face with her hands. "Come on, Mrs. Delgado," Elena hurried to her mother-in-law. "We are not alone in this. Several reports have been filed against this company, so they will definitely sort it out." Of course, Elena hid the words of the duty officer from her mother-in-law. She didn't know what to do next, but it was important to protect Mrs. Delgado for the time being, so she had to find soothing words. We were fooled like children, Mrs. Delgado lamented, and was even happy about it. I told you we would figure it out. Did they mention any specific deadline? Yes, they said we would have to pack our things and move into the nursing home in 2 weeks. That means we still have plenty of time. Only 2 weeks, Elena thought to herself. I have to come up with something. Worst case scenario, I'll lie and say I received the money from them. The next morning, Elena was woken up by a phone call. Usually, she woke up early even on weekends, but the night before she had a hard time falling asleep, so she slept until 10 a.m. Elena looked at her phone and saw an unfamiliar number. She freaked out. For some reason, she suddenly had the feeling that it was the same scammers calling. Elena hesitated for a moment whether to answer or not, and finally decided to answer. Eleanor Gassett asked a firm voice from the phone. Yes, who is calling? My name is Montero. I am an investigator. I have reviewed your report. Could you please come to the apartment today? I can. What time should I come? Right now, if you can. Just bring all the documents, the contract, and the receipt. She made lunch for her mother-in-law and hurried to the apartment. She felt a sense of hope. At least her statement had been taken into consideration, and not just thrown in a folder and forgotten. She didn't tell her mother-in-law that she was going to the police. She simply said that she had to run some errands. Eleanor wanted Mrs. Delgado to think as little about the situation as possible, even though she knew it was impossible. Besides, they would probably have to leave in just 11 days. Elena walked into the familiar police station building and approached the officer on duty. This time, there was a different officer sitting there, who informed her which office she should go to. Eleanor walked down the long hallway, almost to the end, and saw a sign that said, Lead Investigator, Captain Montero. She knocked on the half-open door. Hello, may I come in? I'm Elena Gassett. You called me today. Good day. Come in. Have a seat. Elena recognized the investigator's authoritative tone. He was a tall man in his 40s with grey hair at the temples. He was actively typing on the computer. Elena sat down nervously in front of him, and after about 20 seconds, Captain Montero turned his attention away from the computer and towards her. Excuse me, there is a lot of paperwork to fill out. The investigator began searching for something on his desk. Ah, here it is. I have reviewed your statement. I must say that the situation is not new and rather sad. This scheme has been known in neighboring towns for a long time. These scoundrels settled here 3 months ago. The officer on duty told me that there are already 3 statements. Yes, that's right. Here they are. Montero turned some papers in his hands, but I found his a little more interesting than the others. Apparently, his old lady was more meticulous than the others, so the scammers had to process more documents with her. Can I see the contract and the receipt? Of course. Elena handed the papers to the investigator. Interesting, Montero said, studying the documents. But I must say that I expected more. What did you expect? The donation contract should include certain circumstances that would invalidate it. You simply mentioned in your statement that you were assured in writing of all the details of the transaction. I mean, the promises about the nursing home, the care, and so on. But that information cannot be included in such documents, which makes it invalid. But no, these guys made it all up correctly. And what about the receipt? Well, the receipt is interesting. With other victims, everything was handled through written guarantees. But in your case, what was your name? The investigator looked at the statement. Matilda Delgado asked for some guarantees in writing. So does this receipt have any legal weight? Unfortunately, no. A receipt is issued when it comes to lending money. But here it is just a promise to transfer money, so any court would throw out that piece of paper. But in any case, it is something new. We have at least a sample of your handwriting and your employee's signature. So, if you don't mind, I will scan this document. I don't care, of course. But what should we do with my mother-in-law? I'm a straightforward person, so I won't hide anything. Prepare for the worst. Even if we find something to hold on to, it will take a long time. Do they also have 2 weeks until they have to leave? Yes. Well, with only 2 weeks, we won't be able to achieve much. There is practically no evidence. They do everything properly. Have they checked this nursing home? Maybe they are poisoning the elderly there to avoid taking care of them. We have checked. Of course, it is not a 5-star hotel, but everything is within the legal framework. The conditions there are minimal, so if you have another place for your mother-in-law, it is better to take her there. But she was promised personal nurses, care, and nature. Isn't that defamation? Can't they be held accountable for that at least? Inaccurate information in advertising is an administrative offense, not a criminal offense. And verbal communications. It will be difficult to prove anything. And there is no need. Our task is to elevate this case to a more serious offense. But with this information, unfortunately, it will take us some time to do so. So, are you suggesting that I just hand over the apartment to them and quietly leave? You have already handed it over to them, not you, more precisely, but your mother-in-law. So consider that you are in someone else's apartment right now. I understand your feelings perfectly, but you have to understand me too. I am being as honest as possible with you and telling things as they are. I will do my best, but I can't promise anything, especially in the near future. Hopefully, they will somehow slip up soon and we can catch them. Okay, I understand everything. Thank you. Elena left the investigator's office. Hoping for quick help from the police was pointless. That meant she had to take action herself. She grabbed her phone and started searching through her contacts. She had no acquaintances in law enforcement or the legal field. The only person who had any connections to the legal field was her mother-in-law's friend, Mrs. Fuentes. Without much hesitation, Elena dialed her number. Mrs. Fuentes, hello. I am Elena, the daughter-in-law of Matilda Delgado, your friend. Hello, Elena, my dear. I didn't recognize your voice right away, Mrs. Fuentes replied kindly. You know, we have encountered a very unpleasant situation. About the apartment? Yes. I accidentally overheard your conversation with Mrs. Delgado yesterday. Well, you were absolutely right in your concerns. What a silly situation. This is an extremely common method of fraud. I have spoken to Matilda about such cases many times. Why didn't she listen to me? Why? I don't understand what happened to her either. Maybe they influenced her in some way. They have special techniques, something like hypnosis. They distract attention, gain confidence, and that's it. They take advantage of the vulnerability of our elderly. It seems to be that way. I don't remember Mrs. Delgado ever agreeing to something so quickly before. Well, I understand that you're not calling me just to share your concerns. Yes? You're right. I just left the police station. I was told that the situation is very complicated and it's unlikely that anything will change in 2 weeks. And in 2 weeks, Mrs. Delgado will have to move out. Of course, I won't send her to any nursing home. I'll take her to live with me. But do you understand how hard all this will be for her? I understand. Matilda has given up a lot lately, so yes, there's no need for her to worry about these things. You know what? Come to my house right now. My son is at home. He's a lawyer. Maybe we can come up with something together. Elena thanked Mrs. Fuentes for the offer and hurried home. She didn't usually see her mother-in-law's friend very often. While her husband was alive, they only saw each other at social gatherings and after his death, a little more frequently. Mrs. Fuentes lived nearby and visited her friend once a week, but Elena was usually not at home. During those moments, but even in those rare encounters, Elena had formed a good impression of this woman. Mrs. Fuentes was a little younger than Mrs. Delgado and had a completely different character. Sometimes Elena wondered, how could two such different women be friends? The authoritarian and stern Mrs. Delgado and the kind and frank Mrs. Fuentes. However, both were quite emotional. Both were quite emotional and always ready to stand up for themselves and fight for their rights. When Elena learned that Mrs. Fuentes was willing to help, she felt relieved. Yes, She didn't have a plan, and expecting an older woman, even an old one, to give her one would be foolish. However, Eleanor felt much more at ease in her heart. She quickly headed to Mrs. Fuentes's house, which was a few blocks from Mrs. Victoria Viktorovna's place. She rang the bell after reaching the third floor. The door was opened by a man in his 40s, wearing a knitted cardigan and a white shirt. "Good morning. I've come to see Mrs. Fuentes," Elena said, a little timidly. Yes, come in. We were waiting for you." Elena entered the apartment. "I'm Javier, Mrs. Fuentes' son, a lawyer. Nice to meet you." Elena answered and entered the room. It was luxuriously furnished according to Soviet standards. A wall-to-wall wardrobe, many sets of dinnerware, a huge crystal chandelier, and 2 wide leather armchairs. Mrs. Fuentes was sitting in one of them. "Sit down, Elena." The woman pointed to the neighboring chair. Javier also entered the room and sat in a nearby chair. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Elena said politely. "Oh, don't be so formal," Mrs. Fuentes replied playfully. "Let's get down to business then. Do you still have the papers that Matilda signed? Or did you give them all to the police?" "No, I only have copies." "I have everything here." Elena took a folder out of her bag and handed it to Mrs. Fuentes, who, without even looking at its contents, passed it to Javier. "Well, we have a professional sitting here, let him sort it out," the old lady said sarcastically. "Actually, I'm not a professional at all," Javier said, studying the documents. "I'm a criminal lawyer, and I don't understand much about these civil contracts." "Well, it seems that everything is drafted correctly at first glance. I'll take a photo of them and send them to a colleague. He specializes in this type of transaction. And what about the receipt?" "Please take a look at it," Elena requested. "Same thing. I can't say anything. I can only send it for handwriting analysis." "But I doubt it won't be of much use," the lawyer replied. "This is what I've been thinking about," Mrs. Fuentes began. "Actually, we have 2 options, the civil route and the criminal route. At first glance, we don't have any leads for the criminal route, although if the investigator was interested in this case, there must be a reason. On the civil side, we can demand the invalidity of this contract, declaring the transaction void." "We can't do it," Javier interrupted his mother. "I just got a reply from my colleague. In general, we don't have any leads to pursue the civil route either. This scheme is known not only in our city. These scammers used to operate in the neighboring city as well. He writes that they have tried lawsuits and out-of-court negotiations from every angle. It's all useless. Somehow they managed to get these poor old ladies to sign all the documents, and that's it." "Well, that's even better," Mrs. Fuentes said happily. "Sorry, but why is it better?" Elena wondered. "Because we still have the chance to catch them on criminal charges. And if we successfully solve the problem, we can not only get your mother-in-law's apartment back, but we can also put this whole gang behind bars for a long time. It sounds tempting, of course, but you yourself said that there are no leads." Only at first glance, Mrs. Fuentes stood her ground. "We need to find out in detail how their operation works. I can't believe that someone like Matilda signed everything so calmly." True, she didn't just sign everything calmly. In fact, the investigator mentioned that these social workers often manage without receipts, relying on verbal promises, Elena recalled. Still, it's strange that they managed to appease her with just a receipt, which, by the way, has no legal power, Javier pointed out. "But she didn't know that the receipt had no legal power, did she?" Elena countered. "Honey, you know Mrs. Delgado well, don't you? Whether this piece of paper has legal power or not, you can't dismiss her so easily, and that's true." The lawyer evidently remembered the character of his mother's friend. "Then, I think we need to expose them thoroughly," Mrs. Fuentes concluded. "How are we going to do that?" Helena didn't understand. "But you have me," exclaimed Mrs. Fuentes, an older and lonely woman. She looked at Javier. "Well, almost lonely. The perfect target for this gang. We need to lure them to me somehow. They'll come hunting for my apartment, and that's when we'll try to catch them in something. Mom, wait, are you serious? Yes, Javier, I am. If something happens, you'll be there. But Mrs. Fuentes, Elena intervened, it's really dangerous. Maybe they won't hurt you, but what if they really use some kind of hypnosis and you end up giving them the apartment too? But you'll be there, you'll intervene if necessary. And I think Javier can arrange everything for proper surveillance. Well, I don't even know. The lawyer hesitated. Do you have any better options? Mrs. Fuentes asked. Number Javier shook his head. If it were any other woman in your place, I would be the first to suggest using her as bait. That's it. That settles it. I don't want to hear any more. It's settled. Maybe we should get the police involved in this case, Elena suggested. No, they won't help us, Javier interrupted. They're so overwhelmed that they don't care about our suspicions. So how will we control the situation? What if we can't intervene in time? We'll install surveillance cameras in the apartment, the lawyer replied. Wow. Do you have special equipment? No, hidden cameras are only used in TV shows. We'll keep it simpler. An ordinary mobile phone will serve as a hidden camera. We'll make a video call and place one phone, for example, between the china set so that only the camera is visible, and we'll watch and listen from the other phone. Simple, legal, and effective. It's incredible. Elena was shocked by the simplicity of Javier's idea. What did you expect? Mrs. Fuentes asked. These lawyers are under strict surveillance these days. You can't make a single mistake, but still, Eleanor was worried about her mother-in-law's friend. Maybe she should call the investigator at least. She seems to be a competent person. Don't do it, Elena, Javier said firmly. You see, they have everything according to their instructions, surveillance, court orders. They will ruin our entire operation and will most likely send us away. Elena sighed deeply. She had always lived by the rules and had never participated in self-initiated activities. Neither she nor anyone in her circle had ever had any problems with scammers or the police, so she felt like she was on a TV show. But this time, she had to play one of the main roles against her will. Wait a minute. How do we attract them to you? Mrs. Fuentes asked. Here in the contract. There's an address and a phone number. Elena pointed to one of the papers. Maybe you can call. Say you heard about them from your neighbor, and that as a lonely woman, you need their care a lot. Great idea, Elena. Javier, give me that piece of paper. Mrs. Fuentes pulled out her cell phone, dialed the number, and waited for a connection. It's not available. Strange. Maybe they don't work on Saturdays, Elena suggested. Unlikely. Every customer is worth their weight in gold to them. Companies like these should be available for calls 24 hours a day. Something else is going on. Maybe I scared them, Elena recalled her visit to Jovan Vejez yesterday. When I was there yesterday, I threatened to report them to the police. Maybe they got scared and decided to leave town. That's one possibility, Mrs. Fuentes mused. What if they didn't have time to pack their things in one day? Javier joined the conversation. Maybe they disconnected the phone, but they haven't left the office yet. They wouldn't want to lose a client who would go voluntarily. What do you mean? Elena asked. I mean, we should go there immediately. Mrs. Fuentes didn't give her son a chance to respond. The three of them quickly gathered and got into Javier's car. Within 15 minutes, they reached their destination. There she is. Look at her. Elena pointed to a woman with a bag walking out of the office building. I talked to her yesterday. Okay, then watch carefully. I'll give you a masterclass, Mrs. Fuentes said, as she prepared to get out of the car. Wait, Mom. Javier stopped his mother and pulled out a phone from the glove compartment. He called it from his own phone. Take it with you just in case. We will listen to you. Mrs. Fuentes took the phone and got out of the car. Looking around, she headed toward the woman who had walked in the opposite direction of the office building. Yes, Mrs. Fuentes had an energy that transcended her age. At 69, she could outperform young people not only physically, but also psychologically. Not many people would agree to embark on such an adventure. And it was not clear what motivated her more, the desire to help her friend in trouble or the curiosity to participate in a risky venture. Mrs. Fuentes quickly caught up with the woman. She took a moment to catch her breath and called out to her, "Excuse me, please, what's wrong?" The woman turned around. "I feel so embarrassed to ask, but..." Mrs. Fuentes spoke in a pitiful voice. "I think I'm lost. I left the house wanting to go to the management company. I guess I'm just getting older. Do you have your phone with you? Has any family called? Having a phone is one thing, but what good is it? I don't have any family left. They all scattered and left me alone." "Okay," the woman thought. "What should I do with you? Do you even remember your address?" "I remember the street, but not the house so much. How can that be? Let me take you to the street. Maybe you'll recognize the area when we get there." "Oh, my dear. You're my savior. Thank you. Just save your thanks. I haven't done anything yet." "What's the street?" "San Nicolas. We'll get there quickly." The woman took Mrs. Fuentes by the arm. "Come on, my car is parked not far from here." Elena and Javier watched everything from their car. "What should we do?" Elena asked worriedly. "Let's follow them carefully." Javier shifted gears and drove away cautiously. The woman drove Mrs. Fuentes to the car, got behind the wheel, and headed towards San Nicolas Street, where both Elena's mother and her friend lived. "Do you think she's taken the bait?" Elena asked. "It seems so." Javier followed the scammer's car at a distance. "This woman doesn't seem very sympathetic. She wouldn't just help." He sensed an opportunity. 10 minutes passed and the phone remained silent. Elena and Javier began to worry a little. Had the connection been lost? But as they turned onto San Nicolas Street, the woman asked Mrs. Fuentes, "Well, do you recognize the neighborhood?" "Yes, my dear, yes. Let me continue on my own." "No, let me take you to the entrance." Mrs. Fuentes began giving the woman directions on how to get to her house. In a couple of minutes, the car arrived at its destination. Elena and Javier parked in the neighboring yard. "Now I won't let you go so easily," Mrs. Fuentes said worriedly. "Come in, I'll make you some coffee." "I'd love to," the woman said, clearly understanding that she had found her last victim in this city. They moved slowly towards the apartment. Mrs. Fuentes pretended to be a frail, older woman, so she tried to move as slowly as possible. In the apartment, she sat the woman down on a chair, moved the phone from her jacket to her pants pocket so that Elena and Javier could hear everything, and went into the kitchen to make coffee. "So," you said, "no one from your family is looking after you?" the woman asked. "They've all dispersed. They have nothing to do with me." Mrs. Fuentes made up a story on the spot. "I never asked for anything. I always did everything myself. Shopping, going to the clinic, collecting money. But in the last few months I've been feeling really bad. Sometimes my legs give out, and now my head is failing me too." "What's your name, dear?" "Irene." "I think you're very lucky to have met me today. Yes, you've helped me a lot. I don't know how to thank you, and not only for that. Soon you'll want to thank me even more." Mrs. Fuentes feigned confusion on her face. Scam artist Irene continued, "You see, I work for a social organization. We provide assistance to lonely elderly people, ensuring them a dignified old age. You are so good. How do you do it? It's simple. We offer you a place in a wonderful retirement home by the river, with a view of the forest, nice renovations, attentive staff, and most importantly, you won't have to make any monthly payments. You will have a personal nurse, constant support, and medical checkups. Basically, everything you want. You describe it so beautifully. But I don't have any savings. It's all going to medicines. You won't need to pay anything, I'm telling you. But you must get some benefit from this. I'll be honest, there will be benefits, of course. First of all, these organizations receive government support. there are certain benefits for charitable activities. And secondly, tell me, what do you plan to do with your apartment? I don't have any plans. I'll wait for my death, and it will go to someone among my children and grandchildren, to someone among those same children who left you here alone, who don't visit you and don't help you in any way. Well, they are still my children. It's a custom. Old people die and leave their property to their children, no matter what they are like. You are a kind-hearted person, Granny, but I have a better idea. Our organization will help you sell this apartment at a good price, and you can do whatever you want with the money. You can give some to your children, save some, go on a trip, or spend it on treatment abroad. If necessary, we will help you organize everything. Our residents receive treatment in Israel, Germany, and all over the world. Oh, that would be just wonderful. Of course, at my age, I am not in a position to travel, but at least I can help my children. They say there is a crisis on television right now. I have even considered selling this apartment myself. Why does an elderly woman need so many rooms? But I was scared to deal with it. What are they called? Real estate agents, right? And here, if you guys take care of everything, of course, we will take care of everything. And to be honest with you, this is where our second benefit comes in. We will allocate a percentage of the sale to our social organization. This money will be used exclusively to help other lonely seniors. Well, at the end of life, I can do a good deed. Or not. What are you talking about? It's not the end. Consider that everything is just beginning for you. You managed to make me happy, dear. So what should I do for this? Do I need to sign some documents? Come see you? You don't have to go anywhere. Our representative will come to see you today. He will explain everything in detail, prepare the necessary paperwork, and show you what you need to sign. All you need to do is prepare your passport. We will take care of the rest. I am so happy for you. You are very lucky today. When will they come? Right away? Will you be home from 5 to 6? Where should I go? I will definitely be home. Okay? A young man from our organization will be here at that time. The woman said goodbye to Mrs. Fuentes and left. Javier and Elena waited for her to leave the entrance. Then they got out of the car. They had 3 hours left to prepare for the operation. They went up to Mrs. Fuentes' apartment. Mom, you are amazing. Javier admired Mrs. Fuentes' skills and performance. It's all about skill, you know, the old lady replied modestly. Listen, this is all great, but do we have a specific plan of action? Elena asked. We'll work on that right now. Javier walked around the room, examining every corner. I think we'll set up the camera here. He pointed to the central compartment of the long cabinet, on which a set of glassware was displayed. I happen to have a white phone case. I don't think it will be visible. We'll also have to move the armchair a bit. With a slight movement, Javier positioned the armchair at a slight angle. Then he walked over to a small coffee table and placed it exactly in the center, between the armchairs. Now the camera will capture both the table and the armchair. Mum, Javier turned to Mrs. Fuentes. We must make sure that all documents are handled specifically at this table. And in general, try not to leave the camera's field of view. Understood. Tell me, are you going to use real documents? What if they manage to process something? Elena expressed concern. Do I have any other choice? I haven't made any other passports for myself, and preparing fake copies is risky. You know, I think in our line of work, credibility is crucial. They shouldn't have even the slightest suspicion that something is wrong. And don't worry about me. I'll definitely read the document before signing it. All right. Let's assume everything goes as planned. Elena decided to build a possible scenario. He'll come in, start telling you about his services. You will seem very interested, impressed. Then he will take out the contract and ask you to sign. What happens next? Not so fast, Elena. After that, I will start tormenting you with various questions. If they are scammers, at what price will they sell the apartment? If they will show other documents? Javier joined the conversation and asked his mother a question. Then we can move on to personal matters. Start asking them personal questions about their wife, their children. transitioned to discussing recent news. Basically, Elena, my mom's job will be to annoy him, you know? When a person is irritated, he has less self-control and can make mistakes. Exactly, Mrs. Fuentes agreed with her son, and the culmination of this show will be the signing of the contract. He will take out his paper, and I, the annoying old lady, will transform into an experienced lawyer. I will ask him directly why it says here that it is a donation contract and not a sales contract. He will start making up various excuses. That's where we will catch him because everything will be recorded on camera. Very interesting. Elena listened attentively to the plan. But how will you avoid signing the contract? You won't really sign it, right? Of course not. I will pretend to feel bad in my heart and ask them to call an ambulance. I think that at that moment, he will get scared and run away. He doesn't need any additional witnesses, and he wouldn't want to explain to the doctors who he is and how it all happened. But that's not the whole plan. Let's say that miraculously, he forces me to sign that document. There will be 2 cups of coffee on the table, as the kind hostess must offer drinks to her distinguished guest. After signing, with a clumsy movement, I will spill the coffee on the paper, and with a slight movement of my hand, the contract will turn into a crumpled rag. Well, in the end, you will think of something, and will not let him leave the building with the contract. Just don't go overboard. So, Elena, are you calm now? Yes, that's awesome. Great, Mrs. Fuentes said cheerfully. Then you and Javier will need to get in the car at 5 o'clock and watch from there near the entrance. I'll probably go see my mother-in-law during that time, since she's been alone there since morning. Go ahead. Just make sure you understand that it's best not to tell her anything, okay? Mrs. Fuentes clarified. Of course. I understand everything. Elena replied and headed for the exit. As she left the driveway, she headed to Mrs. Delgado's house. Elena was filled with mixed emotions. On the one hand, it was very important and interesting for her to carry out the plan for the sake of her mother-in-law. But on the other hand, she was very worried about Mrs. Fuentes. At first glance, this old lady seemed extremely self-confident, someone who was not afraid to stand up to scammers. However, Mrs. Fuentes was not young at all. Too many things could go wrong with this plan. 10 minutes later, Eleanor arrived at her destination. The television was back on in the room, and the daughter-in-law noticed that her mother-in-law had improved slightly since yesterday. Mrs. Delgado, how are you feeling? Eleanor asked with concern. I'm fine, Eleanor. Why do you ask? Well, it seemed to me that you were very upset about yesterday. Eleanor was surprised by her mother-in-law's question. You know, I don't remember very well about yesterday, Mrs. Delgado said calmly. What do you mean you don't remember? And the deal with the apartment? No, I remember that. I'll be living at the retirement home soon. You'll finally be free of me. It can't be. Elena didn't immediately understand what was happening. Her mother-in-law had never had memory lapses like this, not even after her stroke. Don't you feel dizzy? Is your coordination okay? I'm telling you, I'm fine. Elena went into the kitchen, slammed the door shut, and dialed her mother-in-law's friend's phone number. Hello? Mrs. Fuentes. Something's wrong with Mrs. Delgado. She barely remembers yesterday, only fragments. Now she is happy because she has secured a place in the retirement home. Ah, I suspected as much, Mrs. Fuentes exclaimed. Matilda couldn't have given in so easily. They must have drugged her, but that makes it more interesting. How is she feeling overall? Everything else seems to be fine. Well, that means she won't die. Don't worry, Elena. Everything will work out. Mrs. Fuentes hung up. Elena became even more worried. Now the danger to the old woman's health was not just hypothetical, but very real. Elena could not just leave the situation like that and, after some thought, she dialed the number of Investigator Montero. Captain, good evening. I'm Elena Gassett. We met this morning, remember? Yes. Have you remembered anything? The captain recognized Elena immediately. No, something new came up. Well, my mother-in-law started having memory lapses. I've never seen that before. I think she was drugged yesterday. Interesting. Send her to get some blood tests done at the clinic. I'll see to it that it's done quickly. But that's not all. The thing is, my mother-in-law's friend and I decided, how can I put it, to improve the tests. And today, someone from the same organization is coming to her house to sign a contract, and the whole process will be captured on camera. Of course, this woman won't sign any contract. Have you lost your mind? Montero interrupted Elena. What kind of self-initiative is this? Are we becoming detectives? But Captain, we had no other choice. Time is running out. The apartment will be taken away soon. And because of that, you are endangering another person's life? The captain paused. Okay. What time will this event of yours be? The representative of that organization is due to arrive between 5 and 6 p.m. Damn. So soon. I'm in another city right now. I won't be able to make it by 5. I'll try to be there by 6. What's the address? San Nicolas Street, House 35, Apartment 12. Noted. Wait for me. Be careful. Okay. Maybe you will send someone else to meet us? Number. That is impossible. On what grounds? Anyway, try to prolong the process as much as possible. After that conversation, Elena felt a little more relieved. Now Mrs. Fuentes would have some confidence in the person of Investigator Montero. Elena looked at the time. The clock read 3 p.m. She decided that it was necessary to take Mrs. Delgado for an examination. If the test results showed the presence of substances in her blood, it would be solid evidence for police intervention. Without much hesitation, Elena called a taxi and entered the room. Mrs. Delgado, do you remember when the local doctor once told us about a special blood test for comprehensive diagnosis of anemia? Elena decided to cling to the visiting doctor's recent words to her mother-in-law. Of course, I remember that. It's still quite expensive. I hope you're not suggesting that I should do it. Yes, that's exactly what I'm suggesting. But you don't have to pay a huge sum for it. There's a promotion going on. It's free for seniors. Until when is the promotion? Until today. And why didn't you say anything all this time? Get ready. We're leaving. Elena knew that Mrs. Delgado would not pass up the opportunity to get tested for free, even if she didn't really need it. 5 minutes later, the taxi arrived, and Elena and her mother-in-law headed to the clinic. There was almost no traffic on weekends, and within 15 minutes, the car arrived at its destination. Elena accompanied Mrs. Delgado to the clinic, sat her down on a chair in the hallway, and approached the registration window. Speaking in a low voice so that her mother-in-law wouldn't hear anything, she asked, "Hello, where should I go for a blood test?" "Which one?" the woman asked sternly. "How do I put it?" Elena couldn't find the right words. "It's for analyzing different substances." "What?" The woman didn't immediately understand what Elena meant. "Oh, you're from the investigator's office? You should have said that right away. We're informed. Go straight down the hall to room 14. Elena and Mrs. Delgado arrived at the lab. "Hey, why isn't there a line for this unprecedentedly generous attraction?" her mother-in-law asked. "Well, today is Saturday, the last day, and seniors don't work, so everyone came on a weekday and got it done." Elena found this a convincing excuse. To her relief, the health worker who took the sample kept silent, and surprisingly, Mrs. Delgado didn't ask any unnecessary questions. After a quick analysis, they went out into the hallway to await the results. Only 10 minutes later, the health worker came out and silently handed Elena a piece of paper. "Well, what does it say?" Mrs. Delgado asked. "I can't see anything without my glasses." "Okay." Elena scanned the unfamiliar numbers with her eyes. "It seems like everything is normal." Finally, she got to the last line, where it was written in big letters, undetected. "Yes, everything is perfectly fine. Come on, I'll call a taxi now." Eleanor didn't even know whether she should be happy or not. It seemed like she didn't have to worry about her mother-in-law's or Mrs. Fuentes' health anymore. It was unclear what these scammers could be caught up in. What could she show Investigator Montero? It all depended on today's operation, which was less than 1.5 hours away. The taxi quickly arrived at Mrs. Delgado's house, and Elena walked her to the apartment. "Now I'll call Lisa and show her off," Mrs. Delgado said proudly as she entered the room. Maybe it would be better not to. Elena didn't have the chance to warn Mrs. Fuentes about the exam, and her mother-in-law's call might cause some confusion. She simply won't have enough time, since today is the last day. Yes, you're right. She should have called earlier. Why are they reporting on their promotions so late? Elena didn't answer that question, but simply informed Mrs. Delgado that she would have to come back in the evening. "Why are you moving around so much? You used to stay home on weekends and now you're running around," her mother-in-law asked skeptically. "Well, my friend came from the capital. We studied together in high school, so I'm showing her our city." "Oh, after the capital. Our city will be very interesting for her, of course," Mrs. Delgado commented sarcastically. "Well, go in peace. Don't worry about me. I'll cook dinner myself." Elena was glad that her mother-in-law was in a good mood. After waiting another 30 minutes, she gathered her things and headed to Mrs. Fuentes' house. She and Javier had agreed to meet a little before 5. When Elena got home, she saw that Javier was already sitting in the car. He looked very tense. No wonder. Soon his mother would allow the scammers into her apartment. Elena opened the car door and sat in the front seat. "So, how is Mrs. Delgado?" "Mom told me you called her," Javier asked anxiously. "Everything is fine. I took her to get tested and they didn't find anything." Javier sighed in relief. They sat in silence for a couple of minutes, until Elena decided to inform the lawyer. "In the end, I did call the investigator. He said that maybe he can come by 6. "What?" "But I asked you not to, Elena. This could ruin the whole operation. What was I supposed to do? Maybe Mrs. Delgado's life was in danger. I had to call to arrange the exam. At that time, I didn't know that I wouldn't find anything, and I also informed him about Mrs. Fuentes." "Okay, maybe you're right." Javier leaned on the steering wheel and was lost in thought. It was already 5 o'clock. Elena looked at the phone, which was mounted on the dashboard of the car. It showed a panoramic view of Mrs. Fuentes' living room. The woman was sitting quietly in her chair, looking through a newspaper. Javier was keeping a close eye on the entrance to the building. 10 minutes passed, but no one who looked like a representative of the social organization entered. After waiting another 5 minutes, Elena decided to break the tense silence. "Javier, tell me." "I don't know why I wanted to ask this question. Maybe it's important to me. Did you know my husband Luis?" Elena wanted to break the awkward pause and couldn't think of anything better than to talk to Javier about her husband who passed away a year ago. She hardly knew anything about his friends. She only saw a few of his colleagues at work, and that was it. Sure, we were childhood friends. Our fathers lived in neighboring yards and our mothers still live there. What happened next? Why did they stop communicating? We grew up. We became big and serious. Everyone was busy with work, family. There was no time left for friendship. I guess that's how it is with a lot of people. Then I flew to work in the States and only came back here occasionally. I didn't really keep in touch with anyone here except my mom. I didn't find out about Luis's death right away. My mom called me recently 2 days later, so I didn't even have time to attend the funeral. And now? Are you leaving again soon? The law firm where I worked there went bankrupt, so I decided to come back here. I've been running my own private practice here for the past 6 months. I thought I'd get bored after America, but as you can see, Javier smiled wryly. I don't have time to get bored, but the cost of living here is cheaper, of course. Yes, you won't get bored with us. By the way, my mum sometimes talked to me about you, Javier said with interest. What are you saying? About me? Elena got interested too. Yes, from you. She said, "It's amazing that the daughter-in-law not only didn't leave her mother-in-law, but also started living with her and taking care of her. Besides, I remember Mrs. Delgado's strong character from childhood. Oh, she's lonely. I couldn't have done otherwise." And you're right about her character, of course. It's not easy sometimes. But she did so much for Luis and me at the time that I'll be grateful to her for the rest of my life. So I try not to pay attention to her sharp comments and just do my duty. You have a heart of gold. I can't imagine my ex-wife helping my mum if something happened to me. You know, even when Luis was alive, I couldn't have imagined living with Mrs. Delgado either. Elena smiled, but then, as you can see, it worked out. So you're wrong to speak ill of your wife. Ex-wife. No, everything was clear from the beginning. Javier smiled too. He wanted to continue, but apparently he thought that talking about his ex-wife with Elena would be indelicate. You can't determine in advance how a person can behave in a difficult situation. If someone had told each of us 3 days ago what we would be doing now, no one would have believed it. But look how life has turned out. I would never have believed that I would be trying to catch criminals. And neither would I. We lawyers tend to see things from a different perspective. Our job is not to catch criminals, but to defend those accused of crimes. The only person I would never doubt is Mrs. Fuentes. She will come to help anyone, at any time. Yes, my mom is amazing. She is full of energy. I worry about her youthful enthusiasm, but it is what keeps her going. I think without adventures I would lose interest in life. You probably inherit that from her. Being a criminal defense attorney is not without its adventures either, maybe to some extent, but I am a much calmer person in life. I think I am more like my dad. My mom did not immediately accept my choice to be a lawyer. I was always saying how I would defend all kinds of criminals. And what did you tell her? I told her what any professional lawyer would say. We defend justice, not criminals. A person can be wrongly accused of something they did not do. That's when we come to their aid. But very often, criminals are caught at the scene of the crime. Do you still fight for such cases? For example, would you defend the employees of that company that took Mrs. Delgado's apartment? You're asking very difficult questions, Elena. I'm sorry if I said something unnecessary. No, it's okay. I can't answer that question directly. Of course, I won't defend those scoundrels. The thing is, I have a personal interest here because these people deceived my deceased friend's mother, and now they plan to deceive my own mother. And when there is a personal interest involved, it is against our legal ethics to handle such a case. Elena sat back and thought, but not about legal ethics. She was thinking about Javier. She liked the way he answered questions, his calmness and thoughtfulness. She found something in common between Javier and her late husband Luis, and for a few seconds, it even seemed to Elena that she was starting to like him. But these thoughts were interrupted by Javier himself. "Elena, look," he said, pointing towards the entrance. A young man in a suit and a leather shoulder bag was standing near the intercom. "I think that's our man. Maybe he's just a neighbor, right?" Eleanor looked at the live feed from the apartment. "Anyway, we'll find out soon enough." A few seconds later, Javier and Eleanor heard the intercom ring on their phones. Mrs. Fuentes stood up from her chair and walked into the hallway. "Hello. I represent a social organization that helps lonely seniors. Our employee told us everything about you." The microphone of the phone, which was already in the service tray, barely reached the hallway, but fragments of the conversation could be heard. Mrs. Fuentes did not keep the scammer waiting at the door and immediately invited him into the room. "I have been waiting here for you. I was nervous for 20 minutes. The woman again introduced herself as a frail and anxious old woman. "Well, I apologize. I have a lot of things to do. I have to visit everyone, help." The employee explained her delay in a polite tone. I get it. I guess you have a lot of people like me to take care of. Quite a lot. But you can't fit them all in the nursing home, as you can imagine. So you're very lucky. I don't even know why I'm so lucky. Oh, right. I didn't even offer you coffee. I wouldn't say no to coffee. Mrs. Fuentes went into the kitchen. Javier and Elena watched the scammer carefully. The featureless young man with glasses and carefully coiffed hair began to examine the apartment. At one point, he approached the closet, probably to assess the glass set. Elena thought he would notice the phone with the camera, and everything would be ruined. But no. After staring at the glass for about 10 seconds, the young man looked away at something else. And here I am. Mrs. Fuentes entered the room with a tray containing a coffee pot and 2 cups. What an attentive hostess you are. The man had earned the favor. Well, why not take care of such a distinguished guest? What did you say your name was? I am Alberto, the manager's assistant. Why so modest? You are already a grown man and just an assistant. Mrs. Fuentes began to implement her plan of psychological pressure on the scammer. Well, why not? I am still young, you know. She paused. Before you know it, old age is coming. So, you need to work harder. Well, I am working. The scammer's tone became less polite. Let's get to the point then. I need your passport. I've prepared everything here. Just as you asked. Elisabetta pointed to the table where she was already filling out the passport. Have a seat. Okay, let's fill out the forms. The man sat down in the armchair, took out some papers, and started looking through the passport. Ah, so you're Mrs. Fuentes. That's right. And why are you looking through there, Alberto? Trying to verify my marital status. Oh no. Why would he need to know your marital status? The man probably wanted to gather information about the old lady's relatives. So why were you looking through the passport? Mrs. Fuentes kept pressing Alberto. I was looking for the record. I needed the exact address. You could have asked me. Why look? Do you think I don't know my own address? Let me tell you. Mrs. Fuentes began to circle the scammer in a professional manner. The camera barely captured Alberto's facial expression, but his gestures indicated that he was getting tired of the situation. Mrs. Fuentes, please don't confuse me. This is an important document, by the way. Well, let me see. The woman snatched the paper from Alberto's hands. Oh, a donation contract, so I'm giving away this apartment? Please don't jump to conclusions. The man retrieved the document. It's necessary. Don't worry. That way you won't have to wait for the transaction to be completed and you can move into the retirement home in 2 weeks. Oh, clever. Very clever. But I heard on TV that you can now register a sale within 9 days. Maybe you should watch less TV. The man was very irritated. Why are you yelling at me? The lady is an old lady. She doesn't understand everything right away. I'm just filling out very important papers, do you understand? And here you are with your unnecessary comments. So where are the documents for the apartment? Like the registration or the certificate? Irene told me that only the passport is needed. And how do you think we are going to process the apartment without documents for it? Probably, she just forgot to inform you. I don't even know where those documents could be. Eleanor was interrupted from her observation by a phone call. It was Investigator Montero. He answered the call with trembling fingers. Yes, you're here already. Excellent. Do you see the red opal near the entrance? Yes? Please come in. Elena put her phone away and turned to Javier. The investigator will join us shortly. A couple of minutes later, the back door of the car opened and Montero got in. What's going on here? He asked angrily. We're watching the apartment. Eleanor pointed at the camera feed. Just wait. I think the interesting part is about to begin. Meanwhile, inside the apartment, the man passionately explained what the apartment documents looked like. After 5 minutes of explanations, Mrs. Fuentes gave in. Oh, I remember now. They're in another room. Wait a minute. Alberto, shall I get them? Mrs. Fuentes stood up and calmly walked into another room. The man watched her. Then she took a dark bottle out of her bag, opened it, and poured a few drops into the woman's cup. Javier and Elena didn't immediately realize that they had to hurry to save Mrs. Fuentes, but the investigator reacted instantly. "Okay, let's go, quickly." The three of them got out of the car and ran to the entrance. Javier opened the front door with his key and then the apartment door. "Everyone stay where you are, don't move," Montero shouted and quickly tackled the scammer to the ground. "Don't touch the cups and jar with your hands. The experts will arrive soon, and they will investigate." The investigator handcuffed Alberto and reported the incident by phone to the apartment. "Mum, did you drink tea from this cup?" Javier asked anxiously. "No, of course not. I immediately realized that this scoundrel wanted to take advantage of my absence." "So it was a setup?" The man lying on the ground hissed. "Well, they won't be able to prove anything anyway." "What do you mean we won't be able to prove it?" Javier took the phone out of service and stopped the recording. "We will definitely prove it. Mr. Montero, please include this recording as evidence in the case. We will do so." Montero took the phone for himself. 10 minutes later, the rapid response team arrived at the scene. They took the scammer to the apartment. An expert collected the cups and the jar in his suitcase. The officers briefly questioned all the witnesses of the incident. They acted quickly, probably due to the many calls today. After the group left, the investigator decided to stay in the apartment and conduct a detailed interrogation. Mrs. Fuentes and Elena sat in chairs. Javier brought chairs from the kitchen for himself and the investigator, but Montero did not sit down. He briefly reviewed the camera footage. Then he walked over to the window, thought for a moment, and addressed the seated people. "Okay, amateur detectives, let me ask you a few questions." The investigator carefully observed each person and focused on Javier. "Was the phone your idea?" "Yes," Javier replied, lowering his gaze. He probably thought the investigator would lecture him on the illegality of secret surveillance. "Ingenious," Montero praised Javier. "You know, for the first time in my career, I feel proud of the legal profession. With such compelling evidence, they won't be able to get away." Then he turned his gaze to Mrs. Fuentes. "And you? How did you come up with this?" "Sitting around doing nothing is boring, Captain," Mrs. Fuentes replied calmly. "And I could tell from the start that they were using some substance." "You're a very brave woman," Montero said seriously. He paused for a moment and continued in bewilderment. "The only thing I don't understand is why, if they use such crude methods, they weren't caught by our department or others in the cities. Dealing with apartments is one thing, but poisoning elderly people with something unknown is something completely different." "I think I know what it is," Elena said timidly. "They didn't use such crude methods before." "I don't understand. So why did they resort to poison in their last two scams?" Montero asked. "Well, first of all, it's not poison, but some kind of sedative that weakens attention and memory. And secondly, I think they carried this bottle with them in every operation as a plan B, just in case. It's just that before they met quiet and naive old women who were really lonely and unhappy. And they were eager for any opportunity to ensure themselves a dignified old age and help their relatives. It was enough to talk to them and persuade them to give up the apartment, so the scammers did not need to add anything to the coffee. Everything happened naturally, but then they met Mrs. Delgado. She probably began to bombard them with questions and mock them from the front door. It is not clear how she let them into the apartment. "I think the scammers used a psychological trick in this case," the investigator interrupted Elena. "It is unlikely that they immediately started talking about the apartment. They probably said something about charity, aid, or a state social program. In other words, they played on her emotions, and when they were already inside the apartment, they moved on to business." Well, maybe Elena agreed. So, they couldn't deal with Mrs. Delgado's strong personality for long. First, they invented that unfortunate receipt. Apparently, it didn't work. That's when the scammers remembered their plan B and added something from the bottle to suppress my mother-in-law's surveillance. Mrs. Fuentes, with her acting talent, managed to recreate that situation, pressuring the man with questions, provoking him. She managed to make him nervous, which made him resort to the method that had already been approved with Mrs. Delgado. "Bravo, Elena." The investigator attended approvingly. "Now everything makes sense. I started to suspect something when you told me that the receipt was not involved in these dealings before. On the one hand, I understood that it was the result of Mrs. Delgado's persistence. But on the other hand, I didn't think his persistence could be dismissed with a single piece of paper," Elena mused. "But wait, if everything happened as I just described, why didn't they find anything in Mrs. Delgado's blood during today's examination? I think the results of the analysis of the contents of the vial will answer that question. In my experience, there have been substances that are eliminated from the body within a few hours. Perhaps the scammers used something from that category." The investigator couldn't finish his sentence when a phone call interrupted him. "What? How is that possible? Who interrogated him?" "I see. We'll think about it." Montero's face darkened. He sat down in a chair. This genius refuses to cooperate. He doesn't want to give anyone away. He claims he acted on his own discretion. He says he hasn't heard of youth in old age. "How is it possible that he hasn't heard of that?" exclaimed Mrs. Fuentes. "Why does he say that? He could face a much longer sentence. Did they tell him that cooperating with the investigation would lead to a reduced sentence?" "Yes, they probably did," Montero replied. "Our young investigator interrogated him. The superiors ordered an equal distribution of the workload, so they assigned him the case. I think these employees had a third plan for unforeseen circumstances, feigning unconsciousness. There are two possibilities. Either they were promised a large sum of money for doing so, or they were threatened. I can't think of any other reason why a small-time crook would incriminate himself. What do we do now? Can we hold the entire organization accountable?" Elena asked anxiously. "We will. We will definitely do it," the investigator reassured her. "As I understood from your testimony, one of the organizers there is called Irene, if that is her real name." "Of course. We need to arrest her and confront her face-to-face with the scammer Alberto. And on what grounds will they arrest her if this young man remains silent?" Mrs. Fuentes asked, based on her statement. "You had arranged a meeting with her, right? That is reason enough. Of course, it may not be enough for the court right now, but I believe that he will tell us everything after the first confrontation. Then we will search everything thoroughly and the case will be solid." The investigator looked at Eleanor. "I'll ask you to take your mother-in-law to the police station. Ideally, everyone should come, but it's crucial that Mrs. Delgado participates in the climax of the confrontation. If I remember correctly, the scammers went to your house together, right?" "Yes. She told me about the young man and the woman." "Perfect. So, I expect them to come to my office in about an hour and a half. But she barely remembers anything. What should I tell her?" "The main thing is that she remembers that they came together. The details are not so important. Just wait a moment." The investigator's phone rang again. He listened in silence, said thank you, and hung up. "Well, as I thought, they mixed a sedative into the tea, which is quickly eliminated from the body. In most cases, it's harmless." The investigator remembered the interruption caused by the phone call. "Oh, what do I say to my mother-in-law?" "Well, make something up. You have a good imagination. It's time to get to work. First, we need to find this woman." The investigator left. Elena returned to her mother-in-law's house. She already had a rough idea of what she was going to say. "Mrs. Delgado, please." "Don't worry. I have some rather unpleasant news for you," Elena began. "You see, yesterday some scammers came to your apartment, but they have already been caught. So your apartment is safe." "What are you talking about?" "How horrible. I allowed those people to enter my home. There is no need to blame yourself, Mrs. Delgado. Consider that it was thanks to you that they were arrested. Elena was not lying. After all, who knows how many more lonely elderly people had been fooled by these scammers if they had not met with her mother-in-law. And now what do we do? Nothing. Everything will remain the same. You just have to go to the police station for identification. Mrs. Delgado was worried at first, but then calmed down a bit. An hour later, Elena was preparing to call a taxi when she received a call from Montero. Elena, the confrontation is cancelled for today. We haven't been able to find the mastermind yet. The office is empty. Everything has been removed. Not a single paper is left, so we'll have to wait. Elena informed Mrs. Delgado that she didn't need to go anywhere today. Elena worried again. What if the scammer managed to escape? Will the transaction be voided? The situation was heating up. First, that employee refused to testify, and now Irene had heard. Elena could only rely on the professionalism of law enforcement. The next day, Elena woke up to a call from the investigator. Everything is fine. We have arrested her. She was arrested based on the description at the exit of the city. Thank goodness you recorded her license plate number. And has she been questioned yet? Yes. She doesn't know anything either. She doesn't remember anything and refuses to testify. So get your mother-in-law and come to the police station right now. 20 minutes later, Eleanor and Mrs. Delgado were sitting near the investigator's office. The face-to-face confrontation had already begun, and fragments could be heard in the hallway. So you claim you don't know this person? And you say you're seeing this woman for the first time? The investigator asked loudly. The scammers refused to answer anything. Montero tried for another 5 minutes to get the suspects to confess, but to no avail. Then he went out into the hallway and called Mrs. Delgado into his office. Mrs. Delgado, please tell me, do you recognize these people? Yes, of course. They came to my house 2 days ago. They promised a dignified old age. Alberto and Irene's faces changed immediately. It was obvious that they realized that all their plans had collapsed. Thank you, Mrs. Delgado. Please sign here. The investigator handed the paper and a pen to the older woman. That's all. Please wait in the hallway. Eleanor and Mrs. Delgado sat back down in the chair near Montero's office. For the first time in the past few days, Eleanor could breathe a sigh of relief. It was finally over. A few minutes later, 2 police officers entered the office and escorted the criminals out. Miss Cassette. Please come in, Montero's voice came. Eleanor entered the office. Mrs. Delgado remained seated in the hallway. So, how did it go? Elena asked anxiously. They confessed, the investigator replied happily. Excellent, but I didn't understand why they came with Mrs. Delgado together. They always operated together. The young man did all the dirty work, while the woman only spoke sweetly and lulled the elderly vigilance. They were already planning to leave, probably to another city, but then their Lady Fuentes crossed their path. Irene quickly sent Alberto to take care of her, while she herself covered her tracks. They caught the scammer, and Irene thought she was lucky that they weren't caught together, but she was wrong. What despicable people they are. Yes, but thanks to you and Mrs. Delgado, we managed to catch them. With this evidence, they will be sent to jail for at least 10 years. Well, I will prepare letters of recognition for you, your mother-in-law, and the defense attorney. And what about Mrs. Fuentes? I think something special should be done for Mrs. Fuentes. I will write a report to the authorities recommending her for an award and a bonus. After all, she risked her health. Who knew what was in that little vial? So we will award her with the highest honors. Elena said goodbye to the investigator and walked out into the hallway. Together with Mrs. Delgado, they returned home. The worst was over. It turned out that these adventures had a positive effect on Elena's relationship with her mother-in-law. Mrs. Delgado almost stopped pressuring her future daughter-in-law and started interacting with her as a good friend. If you liked the story, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel.